Imagine 80,000 heavily armored Russian knights and infantry standing on the banks of the Kalka River in 1223. They are well fed, backed by massive supply wagons, and fighting on their own soil. Facing them is a ghost, a force of 20,000 Mongol horsemen who have been riding for 3 years straight, thousands of miles from home. To the civilized world, these Mongols were starving, primitive barbarians. But within hours, the 80,000 Russians would be slaughtered, and the Mongol commanders, Subutai and Jabi, would be celebrating their victory by feasting on a wooden platform built directly over the gasping bodies of the defeated Russian princes. How did an army with no supply lines, no baggage trains, and no infrastructure annihilate every professional military from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Central Europe? In the history of warfare, logistics is the ultimate god. From the Roman legions to the Wehrmacht, the greatest armies in history lived and died by their supply chains. If you cut the bread and the arrows, the army collapses. But Genghis Khan did the impossible. He built a global empire that functioned without a single loaf of bread. While every other king in the 13th century was worrying about grain silos and slow-moving ox carts, the Mongols were operating a solar-powered war machine. They didn't carry their logistics. They lived inside of them. They transformed the very biology of their horses into mobile food factories and turned the vast, empty steppes into a high-speed conveyor belt of death. Military experts today are still obsessed with how a single Mongol soldier could manage a string of 5 horses, survive on a diet of fermented mare's milk and raw blood, and maintain a communication network that spanned 5,000 miles without a single piece of paper. This wasn't just luck. It was a sophisticated, biological algorithm that allowed them to move faster than the speed of rumor. But if this system was so perfect, if their logistics were truly impossible to defeat, then why did the Mongol machine suddenly stall in the humid jungles of Vietnam and the muddy marshes of Hungary? There is a hidden biological limit to the Mongol way of war, a green ceiling that eventually broke the back of the Khan's expansion. To understand the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire, you have to stop looking at their swords and start looking at their stomachs. We are going inside the most terrifying logistical system ever devised to see how Genghis Khan conquered the world by rewriting the laws of what an army can endure. If you want to know how 20,000 men can disappear into a desert and emerge a week later to destroy an empire, you need to see what happened when the grass ran out. Imagine it is the spring of 1223. On the vast, windswept horizon of the southern Russian steppes, a dark cloud begins to form. But this isn't a storm of nature. It's a storm of iron and horsehair. 20,000 Mongol cavalrymen are closing in on a massive coalition of 80,000 Russian and Cuman soldiers. On paper, the Mongols are outnumbered 4-1. They are thousands of miles from home, deep in enemy territory. And most shockingly, if you look behind their lines, there is nothing. No supply wagons, no baggage trains, no massive stores of grain or mobile kitchens. To the civilized medieval world, this was military suicide. Every general from Rome to Paris knew that an army marches on its stomach, and without a massive logistical tail, an invasion force would starve within a week. Yet, as the Battle of the Kalka River began, it wasn't the Mongols who were starving or exhausted. It was the Russians. The Mongol Empire didn't just conquer the world because they were better archers or more ruthless warriors. They conquered the world because they were the masters of a sophisticated, almost alien logistics system that modern military experts are still analyzing today. while the rest of the world was tied to the slow, agonizing pace of the supply wagon. Genghis Khan's devil's horsemen had figured out how to turn their entire environment into a weapon and their horses into mobile food factories. They pioneered what we now call solar-powered logistics, a system fueled by photosynthesis and the vast green battery of the Eurasian steppe. They didn't carry food. They carried a biological advantage that allowed them to move faster, hit harder, and survive in conditions that would annihilate any other army in history. In this deep dive, we are going inside the Mongol machine to uncover the impossible logistics of Genghis Khan's empire. We'll analyze the biological edge of the small Mongolian horse compared to the massive European warhorse, and the brutal truth behind the legends of Mongols drinking horse blood and fermented mare's milk to stay alive. We'll look at how General Subutai coordinated massive, multi-pronged invasions across 5,000 miles without a single piece of modern technology. And ultimately, why this unstoppable machine finally ground to a halt in the jungles of Vietnam and the marshes of Hungary. If you think you know how the Mongols won, forget the Hollywood version. This is the story of how the greatest land empire in history was built on the back of a logistics system that rewrote the rules of warfare forever. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at a map of the world the same way again. To truly understand why the Mongol war machine was an anomaly, you have to first understand the logistical anchor that held every other civilization in place. In 1223, if you were a Russian prince or a European king, your power was strictly defined by the length of a rope. That rope was your supply line. In medieval warfare, an army was like a giant, slow-moving parasite. For every 1,000 knights, you needed 3,000 support staff blacksmiths, cooks, horse grooms, and laborers. And to feed that mass of humanity, you needed thousands of heavy wooden wagons pulled by oxen. But here's the biological trap. An ox eats so much grain just to pull a wagon that after about 100 miles, the ox has literally eaten the entire cargo it was supposed to deliver. This is what historians call the tyranny of the wagon. It meant that civilized armies could never wander more than a few days' march from a permanent grain silo or a navigable river. They were tethered to the dirt. The Russians at the Kalka River were fighting with this anchor around their necks. They had massive baggage trains. They had mobile kitchens. They had tents that required dozens of men to pitch. They were secure, but they were static. Then there were the Mongols. When Subutai's scouts looked at the Russian lines, they didn't see a superior force. They saw a buffet of slow-moving targets. The Mongols had deleted the logistical anchor entirely. While the Russian army moved at the grueling pace of a walking ox, maybe 10 to 12 miles on a good day, the Mongols were routinely covering 60, 80, or even 100 miles in a single 24-hour period. How? By turning the army into a literal biological ecosystem. Each Mongol trooper didn't just have one horse. He had a string of 5 to 7. This is the first layer of their biological cheat code. By rotating horses, a rider never exhausted a single animal. He could gallop for hours, jump onto a fresh horse without stopping, and leave the tired horse to graze and recover while the column kept moving. But this creates a secondary problem that would break any other army. If you have 20,000 riders, you suddenly have 100,000 to 140,000 horses. In any other military tradition, that is a logistical death sentence. How do you feed 140,000 animals without a single wagon of hay? This is where Genghis Khan's genius moved from the tactical to the planetary. He realized that the Eurasian steppe wasn't just a landscape, it was a green battery. The vast grasslands stretching from Mongolia to Hungary are essentially a 5,000-mile-long carpet of solar energy stored in the form of cellulose. The Mongols didn't need to carry fuel because they were riding the fuel. Their horses were the converters. The Mongolian horse is a small, sturdy, semi-wild beast. Unlike the massive European destriers, which were the tanks of the day but required high-protein grain and constant grooming, the Mongolian horse could survive on nothing but scrub grass and even dig through snow to find forage in the dead of winter. This turned the Mongol army into the world's first distributed network. They didn't have a center. They didn't have a weak tail to attack. They were a swarm of biological units that processed the Earth's grass into kinetic energy. And when the grass wasn't enough, that's when the Mongols tapped into a form of survival logistics that sounds like something out of a horror movie. If a Mongol unit was cut off in a desert or a wasteland with no water and no food, they didn't surrender. They didn't starve. They looked to their horses not just as transport, but as a mobile pantry. A Mongol rider could survive for weeks by opening a small vein in his horse's neck and drinking a limited amount of its blood. They would mix this blood with mare's milk to create a high-protein, calorie-dense slurry that allowed them to keep fighting when any other soldier would have collapsed from malnutrition. They also perfected borts, a type of prehistoric power bar made of heat, dried, pulverized meat. A single cow's worth of meat could be ground down until it fit into a small silk bag hanging from a saddle. A handful of this powder mixed with water could feed a soldier for days. The result was an army that was functionally invisible. Because they didn't need roads and didn't leave a trail of broken wagons and empty grain sacks, they could appear out of impossible terrain. They could cross the Gobi Desert or the frozen rivers of Russia in the middle of winter terrains that were considered natural fortifications by everyone else. To the Russians at Kalka, the Mongols didn't just arrive, they manifested. One day the horizon was empty. The next, 20,000 riders were already in their rear, cutting off their escape. The Mongols had weaponized the very concept of space. But here is where the mystery deepens. If this system was so efficient, if they had truly mastered the art of living off the land and moving with the speed of a predator, then they should have been invincible anywhere on Earth. They had the horses, they had the blood-enriched diet, and they had the most sophisticated decentralized command structure in history. But if you look at the map of the Mongol conquests, there is a hard, jagged line where the unbeatable machine simply stops. It wasn't because they met a greater hero or a bigger army. It was because the very biological algorithm that made them gods on the steppe turned into a suicide pact the moment the environment changed. The Mongols didn't lose to the civilized world's weapons. They lost to a green ceiling, a biological wall that they couldn't shoot, couldn't outrun, and most terrifyingly, couldn't eat. To understand why Genghis Khan's descendants aren't ruling the entire planet today, we have to look at the one thing a Mongol horse cannot survive: a luxury environment. To truly grasp the sheer scale of this logistical nightmare for anyone standing in the Mongols' way, you have to realize that Genghis Khan didn't just build an army. He engineered a decentralized, self-sustaining organism. Think about the math of the 5-horse system. If you're a general like Subutai leading 20,000 men, you aren't just leading soldiers. You are managing a moving ocean of 140,000 animals. In any other military tradition, this would be a catastrophic liability. The Roman legions would have spent 90% of their time just building fences and gathering fodder. But the Mongol horse was the ultimate piece of military hardware, because it was effectively maintenance-free. While European war horses, the massive, lumbering destriers, were fragile divas that needed high-protein grain, constant shoeing, and stable temperatures, the Mongolian horse was a biological miracle. It was small, ugly, and tough as iron. These horses never saw a stable in their lives. They had evolved on the Siberian permafrost to find water where there was none, and to dig through 3 feet of snow to reach the dry grass beneath. This gave the Mongol army something no other military in history had: total terrain independence. They didn't need the Roman roads. They didn't need the Silk Road trade routes. They could simply point their horses at the horizon, be it the freezing Russian taiga or the scorching Gobi Desert, and move. Because the fuel for their machine was literally everywhere, there was a blade of grass. The Mongols were the first army in history that could operate in stealth mode while moving at 60 miles a day. They didn't leave a trail of grain husks and broken carts. They just appeared. But logistics isn't just about food. It's about information. This is the second hidden layer of the Mongol machine: the yam. While the Russian princes at the Kalka River were lucky if they knew what their allies were doing 5 miles away, the Mongols were operating with near instantaneous global synchronization. Genghis Khan established the world's first high-speed data network, a chain of relay stations spaced exactly 1 day's ride apart. A Mongol arrow rider could cover 200 miles in a single day, leaping from one fresh horse to another at every station. This meant that a commander in China could coordinate a pincer movement with a general in Persia, thousands of miles away, with a degree of precision that wouldn't be seen again until the invention of the telegraph. They were fighting a 13th century war with 19th century communication speeds. This information flow allowed them to practice distributed logistics. Instead of one massive, vulnerable column of 100,000 men, the Mongols would split into 5 or 6 smaller divisions, each taking a different route across a continent. To an observer, it looked like the Mongols were scattered and disorganized. But because of their communication network, these divisions could converge from 3 different directions at the exact same hour on the exact same battlefield, with the surgical precision of a modern drone strike. They had turned the vast, empty space of Eurasia into a weapon. The distance, which was a logistical anchor for everyone else, was a high-speed highway for them. And then there was the silk. Every Mongol warrior wore a raw silk undershirt. This wasn't for fashion. It was a sophisticated piece of medical logistics. When an arrow hit a Mongol soldier, the silk wouldn't tear. It would be pushed into the wound with the arrowhead. This meant that instead of the arrow tearing through flesh and leaving a jagged, infected hole, the doctor could simply pull the silk and the arrow would slide out cleanly. This dramatically reduced their attrition rate, the number of men lost to infection and non-combat injuries. In the medieval world, more soldiers died from dirty wounds than from the actual battle. The Mongols used silk to keep their human capital alive. When you combine the green battery of the horses, the YAM data network, and the silk armor medical system, you get a war machine that was functionally immortal. They had solved every problem that had plagued generals since the dawn of time. They moved faster, stayed healthier, and knew more than any enemy they ever faced. But if this system was the ultimate biological algorithm, if it was so perfectly adapted to the planet that it could swallow empires whole, then why did it suddenly and violently break? Why did the world's most efficient, solar-powered army, a force that had crossed the Gobi and the Himalayas, suddenly starve to death in the lush, green river valleys of Hungary? Why did they lose to the jungles of Vietnam, a place with more green fuel than they had ever seen? The answer reveals the terrifying dark side of Mongol logistics. It turns out that the very thing that made them gods of the steppe was a biological prison. There was a hidden line on the map, a green ceiling, that the Mongols could not cross without their entire logistical system turning into a suicide pact. And as the Mongols reached the gates of Western Europe and the coastlines of Southeast Asia, they didn't just hit a wall of soldiers. They hit a wall of biology that Genghis Khan himself couldn't outrun. The Mongol war machine was not an army. It was an invasive species, and like any invasive species, its survival was strictly dictated by its biome. The Mongols were apex predators of the Eurasian steppe, a very specific ecological zone characterized by dry, freezing winters and endless plains of hardy, nutrient-dense grasses. As long as they stayed within this biome, their biological algorithm was flawless. But in 1242, Subutais' unstoppable forces crashed into the Hungarian plains. At first, it looked like another easy meal. Hungary had flat lands, it had grass. The Mongols annihilated the European knights at the Battle of Mohi. Europe was wide open. The Pope was panicking. The Holy Roman Empire was bracing for the end of the world. Then, the Mongols just packed up and left. For centuries, historians claimed it was because the great Khan Ogedei died back in Mongolia, forcing the commanders to return for a political election. But modern paleoclimatology tells a much darker, strictly biological story. It wasn't politics that saved Western Europe. It was rain. The winter of 1242 was exceptionally brutal, followed by a sudden, massive spring thaw and relentless downpours. The Hungarian plains didn't just get wet, they turned into a colossal, muddy swamp. Remember the math of the Mongol cheat code? 20,000 riders meant 140,000 horses. On the dry steppe, those horses could dig through snow to find the preserved grass underneath. But in the flooded bogs of Hungary, the grass simply rotted. The vast, solar-powered battery of the Mongol Empire short-circuited. Without dry land to graze, the horses began to starve. But a starving horse wasn't just a loss of transportation. For the Mongols, losing a horse meant losing their mobile pantry, their blood supply, and their tactical speed. Furthermore, Mongolian horses had hard, dry hooves evolved for the rocky steppe. Left standing in freezing mud for weeks, their hooves began to rot and split. The mud stripped the Mongols of their 60-mile-a-day superpower. They were suddenly forced to move at the agonizing speed of the very European armies they mocked. Worse, they couldn't execute their famous hit-and-run tactics or feigned retreats in deep sludge. The biological algorithm had hit a fatal syntax error. European knights didn't defeat the Mongols. The European climate starved their engines. So, if freezing water and mud broke the machine in the west, what happened when the Mongols pushed south? What happened when they traded the cold bogs of Europe for the sweltering, overgrown rainforests of Vietnam? In 1258, the Mongols launched their first invasion of Jai Viet. They looked at the endless green jungles of Southeast Asia and assumed their horses would have an unlimited buffet. They couldn't have been more wrong. The green ceiling in the jungle wasn't a lack of food. It was the wrong kind of food, wrapped in a biological nightmare. Mongolian horses evolved to digest dry, low-moisture steppe grass. The lush, highly hydrated vegetation of the tropical jungle gave the horses severe colic. They couldn't extract enough calories from the watery leaves, and their digestive systems effectively shut down. Their primary biological engine was breaking from the inside out. And then came the heat. A Mongolian horse is bred for the Siberian permafrost. Plunged into 90-degree heat with near 100% humidity, the animals overheated, collapsed, and died by the thousands. But the jungle didn't just attack the horses. It systematically dismantled the Mongols' most terrifying offensive weapon, the composite bow. The Mongol bow was a masterpiece of medieval engineering. It was constructed from animal horn, bamboo, and sinew, all tightly bound together with a specialized animal collagen glue. In the bone-dry air of the Gobi Desert, this bow had a draw weight of up to 160 pounds and could punch through steel chainmail at 100 yards. But animal glue is highly water-soluble. In the suffocating, relentless humidity of the Vietnamese jungle, the boughs literally began to melt. The sinew unraveled. The tension vanished. Suddenly, the greatest archers in human history were holding useless, sticky pieces of wood. Without their speed, without their horses, and without their range, the Mongols were violently stripped of their invincibility. And the Vietnamese defenders knew exactly how to exploit this. They didn't fight the Mongols in open fields. They used grueling guerrilla tactics, luring the slow, overheated, and increasingly sick invaders into dense traps and tidal rivers. Which brings us to the ultimate biological killer: disease. The Mongol immune system was calibrated for the cold, dry, sterile environment of the steppe. They had absolutely zero resistance to tropical parasites. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery ripped through their ranks. The silk shirts that saved them from arrows did nothing against a mosquito. The invaders, who could survive for weeks on raw horse blood, were rapidly dropping dead from microscopic pathogens. At the legendary Battle of Bakjang River, the once unstoppable Mongol machine was paralyzed. Their ships were impaled on hidden iron-tipped stakes beneath the tide, and their surviving forces were butchered in the mud. The ultimate biological hack had met its hard limit. The environment that had birthed the greatest land empire in history had drawn an invisible boundary line. Genghis Khan's descendants eventually realized a terrifying truth. The Mongol Empire could only expand as far as the dry steppe grass grew. The moment they stepped off that 5,000-mile carpet of green cellulose, they ceased to be ghosts. They became mortal. This is the ultimate paradox of the Mongol war machine. Their absolute reliance on a highly specific ecological loop made them unstoppable gods in their own biome, but completely impotent outside of it. They had successfully deleted the logistical anchor of the grain wagon, only to replace it with a massive, invisible tether to the climate itself. But there is one final, chilling piece to this puzzle. When the Mongols realized they couldn't conquer the jungle or the swamp with horses alone, they didn't just retreat and give up. They mutated. They realized that if they couldn't bring the steppe with them, they had to steal the very foundation of the civilized world they were trying to destroy. The Mongol High Command was about to flip the script entirely. They were about to turn their enemies' own logistics, engineering, and technology against them, creating a terrifying hybrid war machine that would unleash the deadliest century in human history. To understand this terrifying mutation, you have to look at a simple stone wall. In the early days of the empire, the Mongols had a glaring, fatal weakness in their military software. They had absolutely no idea how to take a fortified city. A 40-foot stone wall was the ultimate kryptonite to the solar-powered war machine. Why? Because of the biological clock of the siege. If a Chinese or Persian city locked its gates, they could rely on massive, centralized granaries to survive for months or even years. But the Mongols couldn't wait. Remember the math. 20,000 riders equals 140,000 horses. If a Mongol army sits completely still around a walled city, those 140,000 horses will eat every single blade of grass within a 50-mile radius in a matter of weeks. Once the local pasture is destroyed, the green battery dies. The horses starve, the army collapses. The Mongols realized that traditional siege warfare would trigger their own biological self-destruction. They couldn't outweight a city. They had to crack it open fast. But Genghis Khan didn't have engineers. He had nomadic herdsmen. So, he did what any apex predator does. He consumed his prey's abilities. Whenever the Mongols sacked a city, they unleashed indiscriminate slaughter, with one major exception. If you were a blacksmith, an architect, a carpenter, or an engineer, you were instantly pulled from the execution line. You were now property of the Khan. Genghis Khan essentially executed the largest brain drain in human history. He absorbed the intellectual capital of the entire civilized world. But this created a new logistical nightmare. How do you integrate slow, plodding siege engineers into an army that moves at 60 miles a day? How do you transport massive 10-ton catapults across the Gobi Desert without bringing back the tyranny of the wagon? You don't. You practice flat-pack logistics. The Mongols didn't transport siege engines. They transported the blueprints inside the minds of their captured engineers. They forced Chinese siege experts to ride on horseback alongside the cavalry. When the Mongol swarm arrived at a target city, the engineers would immediately dismount, harvest local timber, and build the siege engines on the spot. It was the medieval equivalent of 3D printing weapons on the battlefield. This allowed the Mongols to maintain their terrifying ghost-like speed while suddenly packing the heavy ballistic punch of a stationary empire. But even with Chinese engineers, the Mongols faced a new problem. Chinese siege weapons relied on traction trebuchets. These required hundreds of men pulling ropes simultaneously to launch a single projectile. It was inefficient, and against the massive, reinforced fortresses of the Middle East and the Song dynasty, they barely made a dent. So, the Mongols issued a software update. When they conquered the Islamic world, they discovered something terrifying: the counterweight trebuchet. A mathematical masterpiece of gravity and mechanics that didn't need hundreds of men pulling ropes. It used massive counterweights to hurl 200-pound boulders with devastating, armor-crushing kinetic force. So, what did the Mongol High Command do? They took Persian and Arab engineers, put them on horses, and shipped them 3,000 miles east to China. During the legendary siege of Xiangyang, a Chinese mega-fortress that had resisted the Mongols for 5 years, the Mongol leader, Kublai Khan, deployed his imported Muslim engineers. They built Hui Hui Pao, massive Persian-style trebuchets right outside the walls. When the first 200-pound stone smashed into Xiangyang's defenses, the kinetic impact was so loud the Chinese defenders thought it was thunder. The fortress that had held out for half a decade surrendered in days. The Mongols had literally merged the engineering of the Middle East with the battlefields of East Asia to break the greatest fortifications on Earth. They were no longer just a steppe army. They were the world's first open-source military. Every time they conquered a civilization, they downloaded its technology, patched their own weaknesses, and weaponized it against the next target. But this hybrid war machine still required brutal, manual labor. Who was going to dig the trenches? Who was going to fill the massive moats? Who was going to push the siege towers under a hail of flaming arrows? You don't use elite horse-riding snipers for grunt work. You use the Hashar. This is the darkest, most terrifying logistical hack of the Mongol Empire. Hashar translates roughly to crowd or gathering. When the Mongols approached a heavily fortified city, they wouldn't just ride straight to the walls. They would sweep through the undefended farming villages surrounding the city. They would capture tens of thousands of local peasants, men, women, and children. The Mongols would then march this massive, terrified civilian army right up to the gates of their own city. The Hashar were forced to do the heavy lifting. They chopped the wood, they built the siege ramps, and most chillingly, they were used as biological shields. The Mongols forced the captives to march in front of the Mongol warriors. The archers on the city walls had to make a horrifying choice: shoot their own families or let the Mongols advance. But the Hashar served an even more sinister logistical purpose. Filling a deep defensive moat usually took months of grueling, dangerous labor. The Mongols simply forced their captives to carry bundles of wood and throw them into the moat. When the captives were inevitably shot and killed by the defenders, their bodies fell in too. The Mongols literally used the corpses of the enemy's population as a logistical building material to bridge the gap to the walls. It was a zero-cost logistical system. The Mongols didn't have to feed the Hashar. They just worked them until they died, solving the labor shortage and inducing absolute psychological terror at the exact same time. The enemy's own population became a disposable resource. Yet, as the Mongols relied more and more on these massive sieges, a new biological trap was triggered. When you surround a city with 100,000 men, thousands of horses, and tens of thousands of rotting Hashar corpses, you create the ultimate breeding ground for microscopic killers. The Mongols were spending less time moving and more time sitting in filthy, stationary camps. They had abandoned their sterile, high-speed steppe environment, and biology fought back. In 1346, the Golden Horde, a division of the Mongol Empire, was laying siege to the walled city of Kaffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula. The siege had dragged on for months. The Mongols were stuck. And then, a mysterious illness swept through the Mongol camp. Soldiers developed massive, black, agonizing swellings on their necks and armpits. They were vomiting blood. Within days, the Mongol army was being decimated by an invisible enemy. It was Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. The Mongols were losing. Their green battery was useless. Their siege engines couldn't shoot a virus. The biological algorithm was completely broken. They were forced to lift the siege and retreat. But the Mongols never retreated without leaving a scar. If they were going to die from this biological nightmare, they were going to make sure the civilized world died with them. In an act of supreme, chilling ingenuity, the Mongol commander ordered his troops to take the diseased, plague-ridden corpses of their own dead soldiers and load them onto the counterweight trebuchets. They pulled the release pins. The rotting, infected bodies sailed over the high stone walls and smashed into the streets of Kaffa. It was the first recorded use of intercontinental biological warfare. The Mongols couldn't crack the city with stones, so they cracked it with pathogens. The terrified Italian merchants inside Kaffa fled to their ships to escape the rotting bombardment. They sailed back across the Mediterranean, unknowingly carrying infected fleas in their cargo holds. The Mongols had inadvertently weaponized the plague, launching the Black Death into the heart of Europe. A biological strike that would wipe out nearly half the population of the continent. This was the terrifying endgame of the Mongol war machine. They began as a pure, environmentally dependent force, living off horse blood and steppe grass. But the moment they hit the green ceiling, they mutated. They became a system that consumed everything. They stole Chinese engineering, Persian physics, and civilian blood to fuel their expansion. And when biology finally turned against them, they weaponized the biology itself. But here is the ultimate, fatal irony of the Mongol war machine. By weaponizing the plague, the Mongols didn't just destroy their enemies, they triggered the self-destruct sequence of their own empire. And the weapon that delivered this destruction wasn't a catapult. It was their greatest logistical masterpiece, the YAM. Remember that high-speed, 5,000-mile data network? The system of relay stations that allowed a rider to cover 200 miles a day? It was a marvel of human engineering. But a network has no loyalty. It doesn't care if it's transmitting military orders, silk, or a microscopic killer. When the infected fleas hitched a ride on the YAM network, the plague didn't just move west to Europe. It moved east, fast. The virus hijacked the Mongol superhighway. It swept across the Eurasian steppe, riding on the backs of the exact same horses that had built the empire. It tore through the relay stations, devastating the logistics hubs that kept the military connected. The YAM didn't just fail. It became a continental distribution system for the apocalypse. The Mongols had built a machine that moved faster than the speed of rumor, but they couldn't outrun a pathogen traveling on their own infrastructure. But the plague was only the final nail in the coffin. The truth is, the Mongol logistics machine was already dying from a much more insidious disease. A disease called civilization. To understand how the greatest nomadic force in history willingly chained itself to the ground, you have to look at what happens when a predator runs out of prey. By the late 13th century, the Mongols had conquered nearly everything worth conquering. They had burned the cities, slaughtered the armies, and looted the treasuries. But there is a hard economic limit to annihilation. You can only burn a city to the ground once. If you want to get rich forever, you have to stop breaking things and start taxing them. The Mongols realized that the logistics of war could be flipped into the logistics of commerce. They initiated the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For the first time in human history, a single, unified power controlled the entire Silk Road. You could walk from the shores of the Mediterranean to the coast of China with a gold plate on your head and not get robbed. Why? Because the Mongols ran the ultimate continental protection racket. If a bandit stole from a merchant, the Mongols didn't just kill the bandit. They wiped out his entire bloodline and burned his village to ash. Trade exploded. Paper money, gunpowder, and compasses flowed west. Spices, silver, and astronomers flowed east. The Mongols became global mobsters, taking a cut of every transaction that crossed their 5,000-mile domain. It was the most profitable economic system the world had ever seen. But it came with a lethal, hidden cost. You cannot tax a global economy from the back of a horse. To manage this massive flow of wealth, the Mongols needed bureaucrats. They needed accountants, tax collectors, and administrators. Most importantly, they needed cities. The invisible, ghost-like army of the steppe was forced to come indoors. Look at Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson. He didn't rule from a felt tent on the freezing plains. He built a sprawling, opulent mega-capital in Beijing. He didn't drink fermented mare's milk. He drank fine wines imported from the Middle East. He didn't wear raw silk to protect against arrows. He wore jewel-encrusted robes that weighed him down. the Mongols had willingly put on the logistical anchor. They stopped being an invasive species and became the native flora. In China, they founded the Yuan dynasty and adopted Chinese court rituals. In Persia, the Ilkhanate converted to Islam and became patrons of stationary architecture and agriculture. In Russia, the Golden Horde settled into massive fortified trade hubs along the Volga River. The open-source military had successfully downloaded the software of the civilized world, but in doing so, they overwrote their own source code. The biological cheat code that made them invincible, the 5 horse strings, the blood diet, the absolute terrain independence was completely abandoned. Why sleep in the snow and eat pulverized meat powder when you own a palace with heated floors and a team of royal chefs? Within 3 generations, the terrifying solar-powered war machine had grown soft. They were no longer an anomaly of nature. They had become the exact, slow, bloated, stationary targets their grandfathers used to hunt. And when an empire becomes static, it becomes vulnerable. When the Black Death shattered the global trade routes in the 14th century, the Mongol economy collapsed. The protection money stopped flowing. Starvation and peasant revolts swept through China and Persia. And because the Mongols had stopped moving, they couldn't just pack up their tents and disappear into the steppe. They were trapped behind their own walls. In 1368, the native Chinese forces of the Ming dynasty marched on Beijing. 100 years earlier, the Mongols would have met them on the open plains, enveloped them, and slaughtered them in hours. But the Mongols in Beijing didn't have 140,000 hardened steppe horses. They didn't have the high-speed YAM network to call for reinforcements. They had become bureaucrats. They fled back to the Mongolian steppe, completely broken. The greatest logistical machine in human history didn't die in a blaze of glory. It died of comfort. But the ghost of the Mongol war machine never really vanished. It just went dormant, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. If you look at the military doctrines of the 20th and 21st centuries, you aren't looking at the descendants of Rome. You are looking at the desperate attempts to recreate the Mongol swarm. When the German Wehrmacht unleashed the Blitzkrieg across Europe in 1939, they were using a mechanical translation of Subutai's playbook. The panzer tanks were the heavy cavalry. The radios were the YAM network. The goal was bypass, encircle, and paralyze. It was terrifyingly effective. But the Blitzkrieg had a fatal flaw that Genghis Khan had solved 700 years earlier. Tanks don't eat grass. The German war machine was tethered to a massive, fragile umbilical cord of oil pipelines, fuel trucks, and ammunition trains. When the Russian winter froze their engines and the supply lines stretched too thin, the Blitzkrieg died in the snow. They hit their own logistical anchor. Even today, the United States military, the most advanced fighting force ever assembled, operates on the exact same vulnerability. A modern armored division can move with devastating speed, but it requires thousands of gallons of jet fuel, massive mobile repair depots, and $1 billion logistical tail just to keep the engines running for a week. Modern armies are still parasites. They are just faster parasites. Genghis Khan achieved the ultimate military singularity. He built an army with zero drag, a force that converted the earth itself into kinetic energy, turned human biology into a weapon, and deleted the concept of supply lines from the battlefield. They proved that the ultimate weapon isn't a bigger sword, a thicker wall, or a more explosive bomb. The ultimate weapon is mobility, the ability to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. We look back at the Mongols and see barbarians, but the terrifying truth is that they were thousands of years ahead of their time. They mastered a biological algorithm so pure, so brutally efficient, that modern generals are still trying to reverse engineer it. The next time you see a map of the world, don't look at the borders. Borders are just lines drawn by stationary people hiding behind walls. Look at the vast, empty spaces. Look at the grass. Because 800 years ago, a man looked at that emptiness and realized it wasn't a wasteland. It was an engine. And with that engine, he almost swallowed the world. To see this biological engine operating at its absolute, terrifying peak, we have to look at the single most devastating military campaign in human history. The moment Genghis Khan proved that his logistics weren't just a tactical advantage, but an apocalyptic force. The year is 1219. The Mongol Empire is expanding west, and they have just collided with the Khwarezmian Empire, a massive Islamic superpower that controlled modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. On paper, Genghis Khan was walking into a slaughter. The Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, commanded an army of 400,000 heavily armed professional soldiers. He had war elephants. He had massive fortified cities. Genghis Khan, fighting thousands of miles from the Mongolian steppe, had maybe 100,000 riders. He was outnumbered 4-1. The Shah looked at the math and smiled. He knew the rules of medieval warfare. He knew the logistical anchor, so he didn't march out to meet the Mongols in the open field. He did exactly what a civilized textbook general should do. He split his massive army and garrisoned them inside his towering, heavily fortified cities. His strategy was simple. Let the Mongols come. Let them sit outside the walls. Let their 500,000 horses eat the local grass until it's gone. Within a month, the Mongol Green Battery will die, the horses will starve, and the invasion will collapse. It was the perfect plan. Against any other army, it would have worked flawlessly. But the Shah made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed Genghis Khan was playing the same game. Genghis didn't attack the walls, he attacked the map. Using the YAM data network, the Great Khan executed a synchronized, multi-pronged invasion across a 2,000-mile front. This is where the Mongol distributed logistics became a psychological nightmare for the defender. The Shah was sitting in his capital, receiving panicked reports from the north, south, and east at the exact same time. The Mongol swarm looked like it was everywhere. Because the Mongols carried no slow-moving baggage trains, they didn't have to stick to the flat valleys or the navigable river routes. They poured over the Tian Shan Mountains in the dead of winter. They appeared out of frozen passes that the Khwarezmians considered mathematically impossible to cross. The Shah's forces were completely paralyzed. He couldn't send reinforcements to any single city because he didn't know where the main Mongol army actually was. And he didn't know because Genghis Khan had just completely vanished. While 3 Mongol armies distracted the Shah, Genghis Khan took an elite force of 50,000 riders and pulled off a logistical stunt that broke the minds of the Middle Eastern world. He marched his army directly into the Kyzylkum Desert. The Kyzylkum is 300 miles of scorching, lifeless red sand. To the Khwarezmians, this desert was a natural, impenetrable wall. The tyranny of the wagon dictated that crossing it was military suicide. An army of 50,000 men and 150,000 horses would need millions of gallons of water and thousands of tons of grain. You simply couldn't carry enough supplies to survive the crossing. So, the Shah hadn't placed a single guard on the desert border. Why guard a wall of sand? But Genghis Khan didn't need wagons. He flipped the switch on the Mongols' survival logistics. Before entering the wasteland, The Mongols didn't load up ox carts. They loaded up their horses. They packed their saddlebags with borts, the pulverized, lightweight meat powder. But more importantly, they weaponized the biology of the Mongolian horse. They traveled strictly at night to avoid the blistering sun, dropping their horses' required water intake by half. And when the water ran out, the Mongols tapped the veins of their horses, drinking just enough blood to keep moving without killing the animal. The horse wasn't just transportation, it was a living canteen. They captured local desert nomads, forcing them to guide the swarm to hidden underground wells. For weeks, the Great Khan's army was a ghost. No supply lines, no trace, just an invisible swarm moving silently through the dark. And then, the impossible happened. Hundreds of miles behind the Shah's front lines, deep inside the safe zone of the Khwarezmian Empire, the horizon turned black. Genghis Khan materialized directly outside the city of Bukhara. He hadn't just bypassed the Shah's entire 400,000-man army. He had bypassed geography itself. The psychological shock was absolute. The defenders of Bukhara looked out from their walls and saw an alien force that had just walked out of an UN walkable desert. They didn't see soldiers. They saw demons. The garrison of Bukhara, 20,000 elite cavalry, panicked. They opened the gates and tried to flee. They were hunted down and slaughtered to the last man. But taking the city was only phase one. What Genghis Khan did next reveals the darkest, most brilliant layer of his logistical masterpiece. He didn't just use his own logistics to win. He weaponized the enemy's logistics to destroy them from the inside out. When the Mongols sacked Bukhara, they didn't kill everyone. They systematically unleashed the Hashar. They gathered the surviving civilians, but instead of forcing them to build siege engines, they did something far more sinister. They let them run. They drove tens of thousands of terrified, starving refugees toward the next major Khwarezmian city, Samarkand. To the civilized world, this looked like a rare moment of mercy. But to the Mongol high command, it was a biological weapon. Think about the math of a siege. A fortified city like Samarkand has enough grain stored to feed its garrison for a year. But suddenly, 50,000 terrified refugees arrive at the gates, begging for sanctuary. The Shah's commanders open the gates and let their people in. Genghis Khan had just turned the citizens of the empire into a massive, uncontrollable locust swarm. By flooding Samarkand with refugees, Genghis Khan forced the city's population to triple overnight. The carefully calculated grain silos were instantly overwhelmed. The food ran out in days. The water reservoirs were drained. Disease began to spread through the packed, filthy streets. Genghis Khan didn't need to starve the city. He forced the city to starve itself. He used the very concept of human compassion as a logistical tool to drain his enemy's resources. By the time the Mongol army actually arrived at the walls of Samarkand, the city was already tearing itself apart from the inside. The impenetrable fortress, the pride of the Islamic world, surrendered in less than a week. This was the terrifying reality of the Mongol war machine. Every single action, every movement, and every atrocity was mathematically calibrated to maintain their speed and shatter the enemy's supply chains. They didn't just cut the rope that tied the civilized armies to their grain silos. They tied that rope around the enemy's neck and watched them hang. Within 24 months, the Khwarezmian Empire, a civilization that had stood for centuries, with a standing army that dwarfed the Mongols, was erased from the face of the earth. Muhammad II, the Shah who thought he could outlast the steppe barbarians, fled for his life. He was relentlessly hunted by Subutai and Jabi across thousands of miles, eventually dying of pneumonia on a tiny, freezing island in the Caspian Sea, wearing only the rags of a beggar. The greatest empire in the Middle East had been deleted, and the Mongols had done it without a single supply wagon. This campaign proved that the solar-powered war machine was practically invincible as long as it kept moving. The Mongols had figured out how to operate completely off the grid. They were moving at the speed of cavalry, but hitting with the strategic weight of an entire nation. But success on this unimaginable scale creates a deadly byproduct. When you conquer everything, you absorb everything. And when the Mongols absorbed the engineers, the wealth, and the cities of the Khwarezmian Empire, they took their first step off the grass. They didn't realize it yet, but the immense wealth of Bukhara and Samarkand was the beginning of the logistical anchor. The gold they looted couldn't be eaten by a horse. The scholars they captured couldn't ride 60 miles a day. The biological purity of the steppe swarm was being contaminated by the heavy, slow, brilliant machinery of the empires they were destroying. The Khwarezmian campaign was the peak of their mobility, but it was also the exact moment the mutation began. The moment the Mongols looked at the massive stone fortresses of the Middle East and realized that to rule the world, they couldn't just burn the cities. They had to own them. And the second you own a city, you have to defend it. This is the hidden tragedy of Genghis Khan's genius. He built a system designed for infinite motion, but he used it to conquer a world that was entirely static. The green battery was designed to power a swarm, not a bureaucracy. As Subutai and Jebi stood on the shores of the Caspian Sea, looking out over the ashes of the Khwarezmian Empire, they were the most terrifying predators the world had ever seen. But the countdown to their own extinction had already begun. The biological algorithm was flawless, but it was about to collide with the one enemy that no amount of speed, no amount of blood, and no amount of terror could defeat: time. Looking back at history, the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223 was more than just a military victory. It was a moment when the world's old reality was torn apart by a completely new entity. 80,000 Russian and Cuman troops fell not because they lacked courage, but because they were fighting against a biological algorithm they could not comprehend. They carried with them heavy ox carts, fixed food stores, and the shackles of a sedentary mindset. Meanwhile, the 20,000 Mongols under Jebi and Subutai were ghosts nourished by sunlight and wild grass. They did not bring logistics. They were logistics. They did not march through territory. They dissolved into it. The most satisfying answer to the mystery of Genghis Khan's power lies not in the blade, but in absolute freedom from physical barriers. By turning the horse into a mobile power plant and the steppe into an endless logistical conveyor belt, the Mongols achieved something no empire before or after them ever did: the complete elimination of the logistical anchor. They proved that in war, speed is not just an advantage, it is another dimension. When you can emerge from an impassable desert and vanish into an unsurvivable wilderness, you are no longer an army. You are a natural phenomenon, a storm that no wall can stop. Yet, it is at the pinnacle of power that we realize the deepest lesson of existence. The green ceiling of Vietnam's dense jungles or Hungary's marshes was not a failure of intellect, but the boundary of destiny. The Mongols conquered the world by becoming part of the steppe ecosystem, but they were also imprisoned by that very ecosystem. When their horses' hooves left the dry grass to step into the humidity of the tropical rainforest or the mud of Europe, that solar-powered machine began to self-destruct. It reminds us that even the greatest conquerors must bow to the laws of biology and climate. The collapse of the Mongol Empire was not a tragedy of lost battles, but a silent disintegration as they traded the freedom of the steppe for the luxury of palaces. When the Mongols began to build walls, they forged their own chains. They stepped down from their horses to pick up the tax official's pen, and in that moment, the soul of the storm army vanished. They conquered the world, but ultimately lost to the temptation of standing still. However, the legacy left by Genghis Khan is not just ruins or bloody pages of history. He created a connected world for the first time in human history. The Yam system, the Silk Roads protected by iron discipline, and the intersection of ideas between East and West were the precursors to today's globalized world. The Mongols broke down the walls of isolated empires, forcing humanity to look beyond its narrow borders. The Mongol Empire was a supernova of history, glorious, brutal, and brief. It is a testament to how far humans can go when they dare to shed the burdens of the past to merge with the pulse of nature. We look to them not to learn how to destroy, but to understand the power of adaptation and the importance of breaking the anchors that hold back our own potential. Ultimately, the story of Genghis Khan's logistics is an eternal reminder. True power does not lie in what you possess, but in what you can give up to keep yourself in motion. Amidst the ebbs and flows of civilizations, only those who dare to turn the whole world into their resource survive on the most minimal means and move at the speed of will can rewrite the destiny of a planet. The ghost on the Kalka River remains, not as a threat, but as a lesson about an era where man and nature together created a war algorithm that can never be repeated. But if you think Genghis Khan's logistical mystery was the final limit of human intelligence, you have only seen a part of the grand picture of power. The world we live in today, from global supply chains to modern military doctrines, still operates on similar power algorithms, hidden systems that decide winners and losers before the first shot is fired. We are not here to retell surface-level historical stories. The mission of this channel is to peel back the core mechanisms, the biological anchors, and the geographical algorithms that have silently shaped the destiny of an entire planet. If you appreciate an approach to history through the lens of an engineer looking through myths to see the true structure of power, then clicking the subscribe button is the next step for you to own the key to decoding similar mysteries. Here, we turn dry data into strategic insights you won't find anywhere else. And right now, to see more clearly the absolute contrast between the fluidity of the ghost and the solidity of the boulder, click on the video appearing on the screen. We will dive deep into another confrontation, where the most sophisticated Western logistical systems were torn apart by a system error, similar to what the Russians experienced on the banks of the Kalka River. You will understand why the thickest walls can never protect an empire that has lost its speed. Don't stop here. The next algorithm is waiting for you to discover. See you in that video.